And we'll begin.
Now, as you see, my face doesn't look too dark, does it? Because I could maybe... No?
No, we're going live.
Okay.
Perfect. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, Shiatsu therapists all over the world. I'm excited to have another episode with another fantastic guest who we've had in July. I think it was beginning of July. Suzanne Yates from the UK. Good morning or good evening over there.
Yeah, it's good evening. It's already getting dark, but welcome everybody.
Yes,
thank you for having me back.
It's great to have you back again, and I'm really excited to talk about transitions in Shiatsu and life. And it's very relevant because we are in an ongoing transition right now in the world with COVID and the consequences of that. And I think it's a great topic to dive into today. And so tell us a little bit about your view on transitions.
Okay, so transitions, I thought, as Mihail said, is very relevant because we're constantly having to adapt at the moment. And if you're working with the 12 meridians, you might think this is well, of course it is a shift in the 12 meridians, but really what underlies how we adapt in a more profound way are the extraordinary vessels. So in my last talk, I was talking a lot more about pregnancy and birth and the deeper underlying slower transitions of like the flow of Jing, the essence, like the underlying changes as we grow and develop. But today I want to focus a bit more on these immediate transitions that we're having to make when we adjust moment by moment. Some of you may have seen my presentation I did for the European Shiatsu Congress on the stepping vessels or the Chow vessels, and they're very much how we adapt really moment by moment, but how they actually regulate all of the changes in the 12 channels, so that it's regulating everything. It's regulating our breath, it's regulating our intake of food, it's regulating that basic movement of yin and yang. And I want to show some exercises for this, simple ways that you can access the stepping or the heel vessels. The most simple is actually how we move our ankles, our feet, and then also that's the beginning of the channel, and the end is the eyes. So how we open and close our eyes, and you can hopefully see already that's very immediate movements, and that's the stepping vessels. But of course there are also longer term transitions. So we've had to adapt. COVID's been going on since February, March in terms of affecting our lives, and all these moment by moment adaptations that we have to make eventually build up particular patterns in our body. This can be in helpful ways, or perhaps we get a bit stuck. So if we're constantly doing the same movement, so if, for example, we've been finding all these changes quite stressful and we get a bit overly active, then eventually that builds up a longer pattern of overreaction. And we tend to start to hold it in our tissue. And that's especially in the muscles and the ligaments. And that's really a bit more what we call the linking vessels, which are a bit more the fabric of our body. So how the moment to moment adjustments, if they're repeated and we tend to act in the same kind of way, that builds up particular patterns of tension and holding in our body, which can be emotional patterns or can be physical patterns. And so I also want to look at how these two, well, it's actually 4 vessels, yin and yang stepping and yin and yang linking, work together and influence each other. But the thing that we can most quickly influence is how we are in the current moment. So that's the stepping vessels.
Beautiful. And we are such creatures of adaptation. I mean, we adapt even when we're not conscious to it. And also we inherit in a way through the gene a lot of ancestral pain and adaptation too. And when working with with change, do you start working with the day-to-day change, or where do you start in working with the extraordinary vessels? Maybe you can take us through that a little bit.
Yeah, I will, because that's a really good question. First of all, we have to see if there's something stuck in the 12 channels as well. So you do always have to look at what's going on in the 12 channels. If there's something really obvious in the 12 channels, then we usually do need to include that as well. But in terms of the extraordinary vessels, as you say, a lot of the way we adapt is also influenced by our past and by our Jing and our ancestral energy. And so that's the power of the extraordinary vessels. They're regulating that, are more longer term patterns held in the tissue, but they also are the reservoir of qi. So they're not only regulating the Jing or the essence, they're also regulating the qi. They're the reservoir, they're the underlying source of the qi. And so if there's too much qi in the 12 channels, they can take some out. If there's not enough, they can put some in. So they're quite in from that level. So when I start working, depending on what's going on, but more and more I have been drawn to working with the stepping as a starting point, as a kind of entry point, because as I already said, how we are in the current moment is going to influence change. And also, especially if someone's adapting from a position of ancestral patterns and perhaps traumatic patterns and patterns in the past, it's quite good to start with bringing them into the present. And the heel vessels or the stepping vessels are very much about our connection to the earth. So we can kind of help people to become present and be aware of their connection to the earth. We do just have to be aware that the earth is usually supporting and grounding, but not always. So it's a good way of checking someone's connection to the earth, and if they find safety in that basic connection to the earth. Yeah. And so I often start with a little bit of the stepping, and then beginning to come into where in the body the person is holding the patterns in a more longer term way, bringing in the element of time, of history, of the body like a piece of cloth that we've woven all the tissues together. And how can we start giving a bit of space for the tissues to reorganize? And that's a bit of a slower process, and that's a bit more the linking. So then I tend to go into the linking, and I call the stepping and the linking channels together the yin and the yang. So there's 4: yin linking, yin, yang linking, yin stepping, yang stepping. I now have developed this term, which is my term, which is the outer 4 vessels. So they're more the ones that are related to what's going on in our environment, and more directly relating to changes on a day-to-day level of movement of qi, which of course links them quite directly to the 12 channels. And then what I call the inner 4, the Du, the Reng, the Chong, the Dai, are a bit more slower. I mean, yes, of course, the Du is parasympathetic system, and the Ren is more the sympathetic. Sorry, the other way around. But they're related to the nervous system, so they do have a link. And there are points on the Du and the Ren that link to the linking vessels. This is the thing, in a way, they're all so interconnected, the extraordinary vessels. Sometimes it's hard. It can be a little bit harder to know where to start because they're all interconnected. So I do find, though, coming back to the core 4 is an important way of supporting the nervous system and the basic yin and yang of the nervous system, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic, which is also a lot linked to how we change and adapt in the moment, right, but also regulates at longer terms too.
Great. And a lot of, once we do a hard diagnosis, and we also see chronic patterns as we treat patients, and a lot of the patients that I'm seeing right now in my practice, are dealing with, a sense of overwhelm. And what I'm also noticing is cross patterns in the body between left and right. The coupling of the points it can be so effective, especially for home treatments. Prescribing those home treatments points can be so simple and so effective once we stimulate those extraordinary vessels. Do you prescribe a lot of treatments, home treatments for
Yeah,
vessels?
exactly. I think it's really important because like you say, adaptations, and I talked about how some adaptations are very quick, and it's important that people have resources to connect with what the processes that we've started within the sessions to support and to continue to do the work themselves. So stepping vessels, so enabling people to come into the present moment and enabling them to, if their adrenal system, their stress response has got a bit overactive, then they can do really simple things like slowing down their walking pace and going more into the yin linking that calms the adrenal system down, which often a response to overwhelm can get too adrenalized. But the other response to overwhelm can be to be too yin and to just disconnect and blank everything out and go withdraw inside oneself and push everything to one side. So that's more an overreaction of the yin, and therefore it's often expressed and can be accessed very simply by getting someone to speed up a bit, to walk a bit faster. And those are the kind of things. And for the stepping vessels, the regulating points, so just in case people don't know this, I'll just clarify it. Each of the extraordinary vessels has a pair of points that are called the regulating points, and then this is a way of regulating the whole channel just through 2 points, and the points are either in the hands, in the wrists, or in the ankles, or in the feet, and then they pair with another extraordinary vessel's regulating point, and that's called the paired point. So for the stepping vessels, the main regulating point is actually on the pathway. Not all the regulating points are on the pathway, so it's kind of doubly important because it's the regulating point and it's on the pathway, and they're basically, it's kidney 6 and bladder 62. And then the paired points are the regulating points of the do and the ren, conception and governing. So you can see immediately how it does very much link into the central nervous system, because of course in Western terms, that's what we're using to make our basic adaptations. And the regulating points of conception vessel are lung 7. For me, that underlies also the importance of how breath can change our basic response. The in breath and the out breath, slowing down, coming more into the yin with the out breath, coming more into the yang with the in breath. So again, you can see perhaps a link with the 12 channels. And then the regulating point of the governing vessel is small intestine 3. So that's quite connected to the heart, affecting heart rate. Heart adapts a lot when we're in the moment, speeding up or slowing down. And so we can work bladder 62 with small intestine 3 and kidney 6 with lung 7. So for clients, I focus a bit more on the main regulating points, which for the stepping are bladder 62 and kidney 6. And if I want them to focus a bit more on the governing and conception, it's lung 7 and small intestine 3. They're not, I suppose they're reasonably easy for people to connect with. Often with the lungs, I might get people to do a lung stretch or a small intestine stretch. And with the heels, though, it's really the stepping vessels, also known as the heel vessels, or the ankle. It's really the whole movement. I know I'm using my hand. I will show you with the ankle, but it's the whole movement of the ankle stepping.
Yeah, and there's so many, again, there's so much stress around the wrists and ankles, I find. And even people have deviations, both the way they hold the wrist. I had a fella that couldn't turn the wrist this way, and the story was interesting. He actually couldn't turn his whole arms, rotating it externally. He couldn't do it.
Mm.
And he's a violin, practicing violin since he's a kid, and his mother brought him in. And she said since the birth, he had quite a traumatic birth, he had issues with his arms. So he couldn't turn them externally at all for 18 years. And it was interesting during the session, very light stimulation, very light treatment. He felt an emotional release.
Mm.
And on the left side, and by the end of the session, he could turn for the first time in 18 years the arm externally, and he kept on doing it over and over again, as if he couldn't believe it. He went from a freeze response. I mean, that's the way I would describe it. The young boy or the young man has been living life for 18 years in an overwhelmed state. As soon as he came to the treatment room, you could feel that overwhelmed state in his nervous system. He just, and to me, that's a very protective, frozen, overwhelmed pattern, right? And just to work on the lungs, and and I worked on his small intestine, and to have that emotional release and to have that result was like a miracle for him. He just couldn't believe it because he thought, that's the way I'm going to live for the rest of my life, right?
Yeah, that's amazing. So were you working with the extraordinary vessels along with the lung and the small intestine?
Very, very gently, because I was his first body worker. Nobody has worked on his body before for 18 years. He was very nervous to come in, very hesitant to come in. And when he came in, he was extremely nervous, practically shaking. And, I spent most of the session barely stimulating him, just mostly light touches around his chest and trying to focus on just gaining his trust. But being really conscious of what we are doing moment to moment.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah.
Making it moment to, this is what we're going to do here, and this is how it's going to feel, and you let me know, and moment to moment guiding him through it. And I think being that present with his body for an hour did him wonders, and we got the effect that we wanted, and he came out hopeful. Yeah. Yeah,
and you're right. I mean, that to unpack some of what you said, that the being present and helping people come into the moment, the stepping vessels are a really useful way, but also just getting people to be aware, like you did, of what's going on in their body, and having that level of attention is already, for some people, can be incredibly powerful, almost in a way, whatever you do. And then there's the aspect with him. What he's demonstrating as well is the violin, and he probably, I don't know how much you worked with him after, but once the initial kind of pattern is released, which seemed to be from his birth, so birth kind of trauma held in the body, sometimes can release very quickly and easily. And the younger we are, the easier it is to release. So it's great that you saw him when he was 18, because that's in like for men, it's the third cycle of Jing. He's still kind of going through some of the changes, transforming into his adult body. So because it's still not so fixed at 18. So already there's a more of a possibility to shift. If he held that pattern and he came to see you in his 60s, then all those patterns would have been way more held in the body and much more difficult to release. So there's also that element of time. So habitual, so there's two things. There's the birth trauma. So for me, the sooner that we can work with children after birth, the better. And for me, teaching the parents to work with them, because it helps. The children are way more adaptable than adults, and babies especially. So if we can teach the parents, then that pattern could maybe not have been held in the first place. And then, and secondly, then he was doing the violin, and he'd probably got other repetitive patterns because he's, again, you said left and right side, the way that you're holding the violin is very asymmetrical. So that's an example of how we build up postural patterns in the body, which also hold particular emotional patterns. And that's a lot, we can access it obviously with any of the 12 channels, but we'll be able to unwrap it a bit more easily. I mean, especially that, the violin holding, that's using a lot of muscles in the shoulder, and the yang linking has lots of points in the shoulder, in the muscles. And again, like you said, it's really important to get in that situation, to support the balance between the left and the right, and know that he's always going to be slightly asymmetrical unless he does lots of exercises. So I would give him lots of exercises for the yang linking, but connected with the earth. Yeah.
Yes, yes. I think that's such a great point that you're making, and that's why I think your work is so important, because you really see them pre-conception. You know, you work with fertility. You're seeing them during the pregnancy. You're seeing them at birth and after birth. You know, and then at every stage thereafter, especially particularly women, working with women's health, right, and menstrual cycles, and afterwards menopause, and everything in between, and even death. I mean, you really get that viewpoint with your extensive experience of the transitions in life, right, and the influences of patterns. I mean, we are so fortunate because we see the when the patterns are formed, if you're lucky, and how they end up at the end, and that's such a unique perspective. And if we can work with, as you said, parents and children in the beginning, there's so much that can be changed, both for the parent and the child, because the parent also repeats patterns from the previous generation, right?
Yeah. So it works both ways. If you work with the child, they can release something in the parents, but if the parents work with themselves, that supports the child to be a bit more free of the ancestral patterns too.
Yes, it's and even when I've done, I'm sure you've seen that too, facilitated workshops for my patients, and oftentimes I will have mothers or daughters in workshops, or mothers and sons, and sometimes as they're involved in the workshop with the body, the same pattern is showing up in the body, and sometimes they'll be lying side by side, and I will point that out as it's showing up for both of them at the same time, and it can be quite extraordinary for them to see physically on the other one. Wow, you have the same thing as I do. I didn't even know. And the pain is showing up in the same place, and
so then they can. It's great if they're both there, because then they can support each other at the same time.
That's right.
The parent can support the child, and again, as I say, I mean, it's really interesting when you see parents come in with their babies, because they often think that the issue is, why is my baby like this, and they have tight, even tightness in the shoulders, it's not as held in the body, and then you see the parents have tightness in the same place, and so you have to, for me, it's always the best is if you can work with the parent and the child together, because then they both shift the pattern, and it shifts a lot more easily.
Yes, I mean, and that's where as shiatsu therapists we got such I mean, you can develop a practice just on that. I mean, who says that you have to work one-on-one, right? Always. Why not offer that kind of a treatment or an experience or therapy session where, the mother comes with the child, and vice versa, and fathers too with the kids. And oftentimes, I'm sure you've had that also. Parents will come in and they'll bring their kids or their, young adults, and, there's a problem with my child. Can you fix it?
Yeah.
And I always say, well, if I'm honest with you, you are part of the problem.
Yeah.
So if you want, If you want
Exactly, it's the family dynamic.
to fix it, you have to be a part of the solution.
Mm.
And that's sometimes a tough pill to swallow for some parents. But I do not work with kids unless I work with the parents too.
Oh yeah, no, I agree. Especially, yeah, until they're about 16, 18, because it's just, but as you said, even later, if you can get the two, even two adults, it's going to be more effective. And I think that's an important aspect to understand in shiatsu, that we're working not just on the person that's in our treatment room, but on the whole ancestral line on some level. So if we can directly work on the ancestral line by having them together, then that's going to be much more effective, isn't it?
Yes. Do you do that? Do you work on on tandems at the same time in the room, or?
I tend to work more with them separately, but then teaching them things they can do with each other. So partner exercises, some things they can do on each other through touch, depending on how old the child is, what the nature of the relationship is between them, giving them things they can do with each other. I mean, the only time I really work tandem is a mother and a baby. And then they feel, to me, they're completely part of the same energy field. I don't work so much in tandem with, I mean, I suppose you could, but I tend to work more through teaching them things to do with each other, exercise, movement, touch.
Beautiful.
Mm.
As the work is so powerful when you work with those extraordinary vessels. That maybe you can share some of your clinical experience or treatments that you remember, how, by you working with those patterns, how they start to shift. Because as shiatsu therapists, I always feel we get, a lot of chronic conditions.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes, people have been spending a lot of years and a lot of time and a lot of energy trying to deal with those chronic conditions. And when you work with the energy system of the body, I mean, you can do incredible things with shiatsu. So maybe you can share, how using the extraordinary vessels can really help people shift.
Yeah, because I feel that when I work with people, I can go back to the time when that trauma was created. So, for example, some examples would be working with a woman who's having difficulty with her menstrual cycle, finding out and even taking her back to how she was, how she related to her body when she was menstruating. And then the linking vessels hold that memory, and so you can release through back to how the body was when menstruating, and then it can really shift. So then they have quite dramatic changes in feeling. I mean, I've had women who've not menstruated sometimes for years, and then suddenly they're able to menstruate again, or they've had a difficult relationship with their mother. Perhaps they had some kind of trauma around the menstruation, perhaps the way their mother, or they realized this in the session when I'm working with them, that actually part of the issue was how their mother was with them during when they first started menstruating. And so they go back, they understand that, and then that their relationship with their mother changes in the present, as well as the client's relationship with their body changes in the present, and then their menstrual cycle changes, or they're able to conceive, or they have just a different relationship with their body, with their sexuality as well. It's quite dramatic sometimes that people just feel like this whole weight and the whole emotional patterning. So it's not just physical, but emotional patterning, how they relate to their body, how they start to feel differently. So that could be around the menstrual cycle. For men, it can be, again, issues around puberty. Oh, sorry, you wanted to ask me something.
I just want to have a quick question around that, around the women's menstrual cycles, right? And again, I don't know if it's just my observation or it's just me, or something that I've been noticing just the rise of issues around menstrual cycles, especially for young women, and not only the irregularities, but the severe conditions that are developing at a young age these days, like the rise in the endometriosis,
yeah,
which is really a really complicated. I don't want to call it a disease, like a condition. Uh, I've just seen such a rise, and I don't know if well, I think I know what it is, but I would love to hear your view on it. And you know, is it to do with the rise in trauma that people experience around the world, or is it a little more complex than that? Or
I think it's quite complex. I mean, there's lots of reasons. I mean, one big reason is how to say, and this is actually linked quite a lot, bringing it back to the stepping vessels, is the age of menstruation changed quite dramatically when women started living in cities and more urban populations. So that, even that in itself, is linked to a number of different factors, like different types of lifestyle, but also the amount of light to some extent, when we also had electricity coming in, which is extending the basic yin and yang, and that's also been seen to have effect on weight. So there's some issues to do with light, with lifestyle, the environment, not moving around so much, eating different types of food. And so a whole other thing that's in part of the equation is the different like estrogens in plastic and different toxins that we're taking into our body in the modern industrial world. So there's a whole kind of cocktail of different things that have changed. But one of the main things is that girls are menstruating earlier, but their bodies are also taking in more toxin. And for me, also the effect not just of plastics and other things in estrogens in the environment, but also the pill and pharmaceutical drugs that we're all taking in through the water and through, you know, ingestion, and that's having an effect on it all. And that's one of the main, I mean, and that's quite complex, and you have to see with each person, but it's kind of a changing of the DNA in a way, the epigenetics. And to address that, we do really need to get into the realm of the extraordinary vessels, because they're regulating, like I said, the Jing, which is linked to our DNA, and they're also regulating our relationship with the outer world. So changes in the outer world, as we know, will have an effect. Longer term changes in the outer world will start to have an effect on our body and lead to this increase. But also trauma, you mentioned, there is a lot more birth trauma, because in the past, I mean, you'd either survive birth and it would be relatively natural, or you wouldn't survive birth. So that, you know, again, that's complex, because of course babies are surviving who wouldn't have survived. And again, it's processing that birth can be perceived in a traumatic way, can be experienced as trauma. So again, addressing that as soon as possible, so the trauma is able to be released from the body. And then other traumas around, you know, transitions. So birth is one of the main transitions in our life, because it shifts our whole being from being in water and being connected to the mother to being on earth and moving away from the mother. So that in a way informs all other transitions. So if that transition was hard, then that's going to affect us on some level for the rest of our lives, until we can address what happened and what was affected more. Birth, that transition, what I call the inner four, which are more connected to the midline. So the Du, the Ren, the Chong, and the Dai, governing conception, penetrating, and girdle. Because our feet, you know, it's not until we're one that our feet come into play in terms of stepping and standing on the earth and being connected to the earth through our feet. So any kind of trauma that happens before age one we often need to work more with the inner family because they're regulating more our inner connection. And if you think also in the womb we were connected through the umbilical cord, so there's often trauma can be held around the umbilical cord area, the navel, the midline. So you have to see the timing. So like I say, before age 1 you're probably working more on what I call the inner 4, but because it can run so deep, if you're working with someone who's older, it may be just too much to start straight away with kind of trying to go back to birth. Start with the present, which is where the stepping vessels are helpful, and maybe the linking, how we've built up patterns in the tissue now,
Yes.
and then you can go back further into the history.
Interesting. And you also beginning to talk about men and patterns in men. I'm curious to hear.
Yeah, so for men also, I mean, again, obviously everyone's affected by birth, but the next kind of longer transition is that transition into an adult body. And so the whole process of puberty. So if someone was traumatized during puberty, either through, abuse is the major trauma that can happen there. Sexual abuse, physical abuse, violence, as the body is changing, can be very deeply imprinting. But even if so any kind of even more milder trauma, just not being supported through these processes, not feeling validated, that can really block the patterns for men. So often for men it can affect their expression of their fertility or their sexuality or their body image, weight issues, things like that, which are very linked with all these changes of puberty. So I'm saying more and more I'm working also with men and understanding the patterns, because male cycles obviously are not quite as defined as female cycles in terms of there being a monthly cycle. But still these longer transitions of 8 years for men are important in seeing where things are becoming blocked within the body and which is the best approach.
But, I always say we do have that time of the month too. We just don't acknowledge it.
But is it a month? Because I've read somewhere that's been kind of exploring this, that it maybe isn't, it's more the cycle of production of the sperm, perhaps. It could be like 3 months or like longer, or seasonal. It can be related a bit to the seasons, as are women's cycles can be affected by the seasons. Do you think it's a monthly cycle for men? Or is it different?
I'm just joking, I think, but
yeah.
I think men, more and more men are, I guess, getting sensitive with their body or being more in touch with their body now than ever before.
Yeah.
But some of the trends that I've noticed in my practice, just more men allowing themselves to get very emotional, especially once they stop, of course, numbing themselves with either distractions, work, or drugs, or drinking, and that's when they start to get overwhelmed with their emotions. And that's usually when I see them, and having them deal with the emotional aspects, what they've been numbing.
Yeah.
And you can see in their health and well-being, and even in the chemistry of the blood and the blood work, how it starts to change with hormones, and also the traditional midlife crisis. I don't know if it's a midlife anymore. It's around transitions, where now I'm seeing it's around transitions where where men identify themselves so much with their work and this personality that they create around their work, and suddenly they're laid off, or they're forced to retire, or there's a change, and you can see them just dropping into a depression, right?
Yeah, I think it is important to acknowledge that for men, because historically they have been a lot more identified with their work, whereas for women it's a more recent thing that they've become more identified with their work. And before they were more identified with children, but now it's shifting and kind of everybody's identifying more with work. But I agree, for men it's often it is often to do with that, how to shift the energy if the nature of work changes, when so much of their core identity is connected to work. And work, as you said, can often be a way of numbing other sensations, being too active in work in the outer world and not enough taking stock of what's going on or giving space or even valuing. And that is beginning to shift now.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I get the, I call it the CEO syndrome. Once they stop being that executive or CEO, they just are falling apart. But they've numbed it for so long, it's hard for them to understand why they feel the way that they feel or why their body is doing what it's doing. And also there's the other section of men where they try to be good men today, and then, they try to do everything just like women. They try to be good providers and good at their careers and good parents and good husbands and good men, but it's just a lot. It's just a lot for a lot of men. Yeah, it's an interesting time where we are constantly dealing with transitions.
Yeah. But as you also, as you say, in the modern world, it's often is more patterns of overwhelm, isn't it?
Yes.
Too many things to do, too many different roles, many of which are relatively new roles, like men taking more their place within the family and women taking more their place in the outer world. So that's not an experience necessarily held in the ancestral memory. And so there has to be an adaptation to that, to be able to process the different aspects, the new roles.
Yeah, absolutely. And that overwhelm, what it does to the endocrine system and the nervous system and eventually the immune system too, as you get depleted, and you throw a pandemic around the background of all of that. Yeah, a lot of families and people in general are just really overwhelmed, right?
Yeah. Although we have to remember, for some, actually, if they've been a bit overstimulated in the outer world, having a bit of time out, I found for some people has actually been quite helpful, because they realise how overstimulated they've been, and they are slowing down. Their stepping vessels are going more into the yin. The yang is being calmed down, and that can offer an opportunity to shift the patterns.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know in the UK, but here in British Columbia, Canada, we have lots of parks, and it was amazing to see all the parks were full during the pandemic because we had a great spring, and so many families were in the parks. It was one of the best memories out of this will be that, just seeing all the families using, the outdoors, exercising, biking. It was great. So it did bring a lot of families closer together.
Yeah.
It's a great. You're right. There's a great balancing effect that for some the ongoing stress of the unknown is too much. For some, this has been a huge reprieve and coming back to balance.
Yeah. Do you want to do some exercises?
Let's do it.
I was thinking at the time to just give people maybe a bit of an experience, especially for those who are less familiar with the extraordinary vessels.
Let's do it. Yeah. Let's take us.
Because I can do them quite simply, like how I teach my clients.
Yeah.
So basically the most simple is really the stepping vessels. And I already said it's kidney 6, which is the ankle bone on the inside, and bladder 62 on the outside. But you don't necessarily have to be too precise, because it's actually the whole of the ankle, and it's that movement of stepping. So there's also some connections with the pelvis and the arms, especially large intestine in the arms. But the other key area is the eyes, the inside corner of the eyes, bladder 1. And that's very connected to, obviously, to the brain and to regulation of light and dark. So even the fact of opening and closing the eyes has quite a strong effect. So I'll take you through a few of the stepping vessels, and then we'll go in, and they're very linked with the bones. And then we'll do a bit about the linking, which is a bit more in the muscle of the shoulder and the muscles of the abdomen, where we tend to hold, a lot of people do, that's their protection. of their heart.
Yes.
And the abdomen is really, in a way, the protection of the kidneys and the reproductive organs. And I'll give you some exercises for that. And the linking vessel, the regulating points, they make a pair, you see. The stepping are more connected with the earth first, and the linking, they're regulating points at points that I think everybody knows, heart protector 6 and triple heater 5. So they're very much the opposite. So that's the sort of connect heart and the arms and our connection to heaven. And I have this image of wings that I often use with my clients. So I'll give you a few simple exercises for those.
Okay.
So the first, the stepping, is really to feel this stepping action. So kind of step. I'm not going to walk around, but you can just get the feeling by rocking forwards and backwards. So again, and putting your hands on your hips to feel how this is bringing the energy back into the center, back into the pelvis. It can be good to just feel the hips and the bones of the hips and the pelvis. And of course, it's important to swap at some point and rock to the other side. And so noticing if the tendency is to rock a bit quickly or to go slowly, and maybe try and find a balance for each person between that movement. So if you're doing it at home, you could even walk around. So I often get clients to walk and notice how they're walking. I won't do too much walking because I'll go off the camera, but just walking. So walking forwards and really first placing the heel coming down, and then stepping through to kidney 1, and then that transition of the other leg, heel coming down. And you can practice that, the feeling of that coming forwards, but also you can do that coming backwards. So if someone's a bit overly active in the yang, I actually get them to focus a bit more on walking backwards, because that just brings a very different quality into the movement. And we can also just focus on the arms. Just once you've got a connection to the pelvis, just feel the arms being relaxed. And it's very much the bones, first the bones, feeling the weight of the body, standing and feeling the bones moving. So the other thing that you can add into that, so these are all very simple, accessible movements, are doing it with the eyes closed or the eyes open. So focusing on bladder 1, even holding bladder 1, and moving with the eyes closed. So moving with the eyes closed obviously brings in a very different quality. That's going more into the yin. You may find that harder coming forwards, but often people find it easier because going backwards is more yin, to do that sinking as you're walking backwards. So already in that, there's quite a lot for people to play around with. But we can even add another thing, which is really pausing for a moment, because the stepping is also how do we stand on the earth. Walking is the more yang aspect, but standing is just being still and feeling the yin. And then we can start to feel how we're anchored to the earth, roots coming down. That is a bit more penetrating vessel. But then we can break down this stepping movement by actually just bringing one leg up and pausing. So we're balancing. So this standing leg has to really, you can feel it's constantly having to adapt. It's not like when we have both feet, we constantly have to adapt, and that stimulates the adaptive nature within the body. But also if we close our eyes, then we actually having to adapt very differently, and it engages the brain in a very, very different kind of a way. So it's obviously, it's also about balancing between left and right. So it's very important to do these movements on both sides. So we'll do that now to balance. Standing and really feeling how the other leg is having to constantly adapt. And it's the muscles that are adapting a lot, isn't it? Different muscles tightening and releasing. So really engaging, being aware of the pelvis. Feel this is more in the yang, in space, and closing the eyes. Again, that's really engaging the connection with the brain, with the whole nervous system. And that's basically any balancing exercises. There are many in yoga, many that we do. Any balancing exercises are good for the stepping vessels, standing balances, but also making sure that some are done with the eyes closed. So that's quite a simple way that maybe you could already start working with that with clients, these stepping movements.
I love
and
that.
eyes closed, forwards, backwards, eyes closed, eyes open. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that, especially the eyes closed one. That's a challenging one, but that's a great way to teach the metaphor of adaptation, right? Adapting to.
Yeah, exactly. That you are actually constantly doing it, even if you're not aware of it. So that's the stepping. And just to balance that, I want to do the linking, which actually start with the arms. So that's a lot more first about our connection to the space. And I often get people to kind of imagine they're like a bit like a bird. And so you can kind of come up and up on the heel, lift the heels up and just bring.
Oh, there's a little freeze here.
Have I frozen? Oh,
There you go.
oh, okay. It shouldn't really freeze, but anyway, yeah, opening up and feeling that openness to space, and then the gathering in. So like a bird flying, and getting people to be aware, try to feel it's like earth and then moving up. So to keep the shoulders relaxed, I think that image of the wings can be quite helpful. Flying into space, and especially the regulating points are heart protector 6 and triple heater 5. So really moving the feeling the tips of the wings, moving up, feeling the tips of the wings, and feeling again how much to be in the space. It could be, feeling the earth and rising up like a slow bird flapping their wings. But also you can get a bit more, even lifting a leg and being a bit more, less connected to the earth. Flying in the space. And already that's really releasing a lot of tension that can be held in the shoulders. So it's also being aware, helps people be aware, how much are they able to open their heart and feel the space around them, but also how much to gather in. For some people, I might need to focus a bit more the wings, gathering in, how they protect themselves. Obviously, that's heart protector. So this balance between opening the heart and drawing in the heart. So that's the yin and the yang of the linking vessels that we may need to encourage some people more to open up and be in the space, and others more to gather in and be the bird that's coming into more of a nesting space. And then the gathering in, we can also focus on, this is a lot the yin linking, the abdominal muscles, which as we age often tend to get weaker, especially after women have had children. But also for men, if they middle age, often men put on weight, so the muscles get a bit weaker. So I often do this gathering where you cross your hands and you gather on the outer borders of the recti muscle, kind of along the stomach. No, stomach, yeah. Spleen, all the spleen points. So you really gather. So using the out breath, feel there's a gathering in. This is a lot the nature of the yin linking, kind of gathering in from space. So gathering in the arms, but also gathering in with the abdomen. So breathing in and breathing out and gathering in. Maybe closing the eyes to focus a bit more on that inward movement of the yin linking. Gathering in from the space. And then both come back to the center. Conception vessel 23 is a point on the yin linking that's kind of gathering the space energy down. And then on the yang linking, just right under the occiput, I'll come a bit closer. So governing vessel 15, 16, and holding. So can be nice. You can stand, or if you want, you could come and sit back down and just let everything kind of draw back in to the center. So that's the link. It is important, I feel, in the work that we do with our clients, but also when we show them exercises, that we bring them back into their midline so they're not getting dispersed, and that just helps regulate the whole nervous system, the yin and the yang. They might want to close their eyes or open their eyes, but that's a good way of drawing everything back. And that's also often how I finish my sessions. I do some work with the midline, just allowing everything to come back into center.
Yeah.
Maybe I finish with the midline, or maybe I go back to the feet to just hold the two sides, and just, that's a way of helping the client make the transition from having received the shiatsu, being more inward, to then, well, what are they next going to do after the shiatsu? How are they going to walk out of your room, and how are they going to engage with the outer world?
Beautiful. Wow.
And
Thank you.
yeah, that gesture's also coming back to the midline.
Yeah, that was such a great way of showcasing, the movements and the effects on the vessels.
Yeah.
And again, it's such a great way of ending a session. I find I'm drawn always to do that at the end of sessions, just to help complete the sessions and bring them back to their center.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
And then the body can do what it needs to do.
Exactly. Yeah, and then help them. Yeah, it's a good point about the walking, to bring them back to walking differently, holding themselves differently. All those exercises are so useful, and having them experience what's the effect of that. Wow,
Yeah.
what happens?
Yeah.
Teaching them how to gather the energies, right? I use a word that with my patients, insulation. You need to insulate yourself and gather and nourish yourself before we create any changes. And showcasing those movements and emphasizing, slowing down the way you walk, or feel your feet differently. I mean, those are all great body-mind exercises to start harnessing energies, right, for change.
Yeah. And they're quite simple, and people will remember them. And then you can just keep reminding them, like, you notice how they walk in when they come and see you, you get them to be aware of it, you encourage them to be aware of how they're going to move when they come out of the session. So yeah, the stepping vessels are great for those really kind of moment-to-moment awarenesses. And then the linking is a bit more the longer term patterns, because we're aware, well, actually, if I've got tension in my shoulders, it may take a bit more work to start releasing that. And if I have weakness in my abdominal muscles, of course, there might be other exercises additionally that I will need to do. But it's bringing that basic awareness of what they need to do. And then that motivates them to carry on with the work themselves, because that's quite important, isn't it? They need to feel motivated and that it's accessible. Yeah.
Yeah, I know that they're motivated when they come for their subsequent sessions, and they're testing me. How am I walking? Am I walking? Yeah. And then they're really motivated and really engaged, and that's what you want, a very engaged,
exactly.
co-creative process. And they do notice sometimes tremendous shifts in just changing the pace, the speed, bringing out that moment-to-moment awareness that you mentioned. It can be a game changer initially for a lot of people, because they're just habitually like a machine running themselves or being run, and that takes a toll. So when you bring them to that moment-to-moment awareness, that could be a game changer for a lot of people. Yeah,
exactly. I find that it is.
beautiful. Well, thank you. Where can we find more about you and more about the governing vessels and the conception vessels and all those beautiful extraordinary vessels?
Well, actually, on my website, which is wellmother.org, I have got quite a lot of blogs on the extraordinary vessels where I've written about them.
Great.
And I'm also beginning to put more videos of them open to the public on my YouTube channel, which is also Wellmother. And I do also have an online course. I'm putting more energy into my online courses at the moment. And I'm upgrading that, partly because I'm creating more videos and more blogs, and they're probably the main ways that you can get. And I'm trying to also do Instagram posts about, getting people to be aware of transitions and different aspects of the extraordinary vessels and the cycles of life and shorter and longer transitions, because we're in a transitional season, aren't we, now as well?
Yep.
Autumn and gathering into the yin. So to see that in a more global way than just the metal, the lung and the large intestine, but the whole movement towards the yin.
Well, you're so much of an inspiration and just a wealth of knowledge and experience and a great resource for all of us in the community. Thank you again for joining me for another wonderful session. And I look forward to seeing your tutorials and videos. And it was such a great topic. And out there in the Facebook community, if you comment, if you can ask questions, Suzanne will be more than happy to answer, and so will I. So just put your comments under the video and share it with our colleagues all over the world. Thank you very much.
Yeah, great. And yes, I'm more than happy to answer questions. And yeah, so I'll keep an eye on the Facebook page too and make sure that I answer questions.
Perfect. Thank you again.
Thank you.